He would give you an answer, and it sounded spiritual. You would just assume he's right and you're wrong. He used the prophetic to tell people not to leave. I will not speak on this issue publicly, but if I'm asked, I will be honest. Mike was acting in a way I'd never seen him. I had to oppose Mike and literally say, you're going to give account at the judgment seat if you don't let us investigate this.
Well, guys, welcome to another episode of the Wake Up and Win podcast. We've got a real treat for you today. We have got the Hood men. We've got Alan Hood and Samuel Hood on the line with us today, and we're very, very excited to have them. This has kind of been a long time coming. I've been really hoping to have this conversation, and Alan reached out and said he's ready to chat with us, and we're just really honored that you guys would be on. So welcome to Alan and Samuel. Welcome, guys.
Welcome.
Oh, it's good to be here.
So Alan, I know that we know you, and a lot of people in the IHOP community over the years have known you. But as we were saying before, not everybody's been following the story as closely. And there are a lot of people now that do follow this story that go, I know Mike Bickle, and maybe I saw a couple of the guys on stage over the fallout with everything, but who is Alan Hood? Like, how did you get involved in IHOP Kansas City? How did you find yourself being a pretty pivotal part of IHOP Kansas City? You ended up being like the president of IHOPU, correct, of the school? And
that's correct.
Probably lots of different titles. So give us a background of you, man, as what led you to Kansas City.
Yeah, I appreciate that. First, thank you guys. Just thank you for the way you covered this entire thing and the spirit in which you do it. And I just want to say that up front. It means a lot to us, the way you covered it and the way you carried your hearts. And I can speak for Samuel and I. We've been really grateful. So, but as far as me, I grew up in Florida. I grew up a United Methodist and felt the call to the ministry in high school after really my dad helped bring me to the Lord. I knew that I always grew up. I knew that God loved me in Christ Jesus, but I didn't think he liked me too much. After I came into the kingdom, I felt like a massive failure. And in that feeling of God's disappointment over my life, I felt dirty, so I acted dirty, and I began to rebel. And my father came after me and showed me what the cross was like, showed me God's pursuing heart. He kind of broke the rules and came after his son when his son didn't deserve it. And it was in that interaction with my father that I really experienced the love of God and gave my life to the Lord and felt the call to the ministry. Began to pursue ordination in the United Methodist Church, went to a liberal arts college for theology and Christian education. And from there, went to Asbury Seminary, graduated from Asbury Seminary, and found myself in Kansas City in 1998, January of 1998, and came on staff for what used to be Metro Christian Fellowship. For my first staff meeting was March 14th, I believe, 1999. And in that first staff meeting, Mike Bickle announced, we're going to begin the House of Prayer. And so I was the Dean of Students for Grace Training Center underneath Sam Storms. Sam Storms was an amazing boss and worked for him. But that was my very first staff meeting. I come from a background of Methodism, and while I was at Asbury, I helped plant a church there.
Asbury is a Methodist school, isn't it? Asbury College?
It's a Methodist. That's exactly right. It's a Wesleyan school in the Wesleyan tradition. And so I was part of a church planting network there and did some other things and really was impacted by my time at Asbury as far as revival and prayer. And at that point in my life, there was two kind of things going on. One was missional community, and the other was this revival of spiritual disciplines. And I kind of chose that path of spiritual disciplines and intercession and wanted to do Christian community from a place of the formation, spiritual formation. So I found myself in Kansas City right at the time when the House of Prayer was being birthed, joined the staff, and within, Floyd McClung came in to take over the church. Mike Bickle was released to do the House of Prayer. As the Dean of Students, the school was training church planters for Floyd. So I was teaching and on cell church planning, and at the same time, it was training musicians, intercessors, and worship leaders for the House of Prayer. So I was in both worlds, kind of doing church planting training and House of Prayer training. And within 2 years, I decided I had to pick which one I was going to do. I went to the House of Prayer, and within, I'd say about 6 months, I became the associate director. And then in 2003, also became the president of the university, what would become the university. And then I finished up my time at Kansas City as the pastor, the executive pastor. I laid down the university after 13 years and became the executive pastor for our community life expression.
You mean
and remained the associate director.
By 2018, when you left, that's what you were doing? Is that?
I was associate director, and Mike and I kind of swapped places. He became the president of the university, and I shifted over to give my time to building the community.
Okay, got it. So you were you came right when Mike started the House of Prayer. Did you come because you had heard an audio from Mike, or what brought you to Kansas City?
My brother-in-law Ed Hackett had been there since 1996.
Okay.
I mean, actually 1993. Maybe 92. The years have kind of merged together. This last year seemed like 10 years. Everything's kind of merged together. But Ed and Linda Hackett had moved to be a part of the church. We had lived with them for 10 months way back in 92, 93, experienced the church, and just took 10 months before I went to seminary. Then I went to seminary, and after seminary went back in 1999, found myself on staff working with Sam. The very first staff meeting was the House of Prayer. What drew us was just that, charismatic, non-hypey. The worship was non-hypey. There was the belief in the gifts of the Spirit, but it wasn't necessarily Pentecostalism. So it was kind of right down our alley to kind of experience. We never experienced anything like that in our United Methodist background. So it was new. It was thrilling. You could raise your hands a little bit. And back in those days, if you remember in 1998, raising your hands was like a big deal. Yeah. For denominational people.
It's revival. We had 5 people raise their hands today.
Yeah. So the worship experience, the spiritual disciplines, Kansas City was a place of prayer. It became a spiritual retreat for where my wife and I, from 1992, 93, we would go back for Passion for Jesus conferences while we were in seminary. And it just became a resource of life. And our brother and sister-in-law was there with their family. We loved them dearly. Ed was my best friend. And so over the years, we would visit it. And so in 1998, 99, we decided, hey, I think the Lord's leading us there. And we found ourselves at the right place, the right time, and jumped on staff.
So it was like a mecca of sorts for you guys, a spiritual retreat center, a place of going.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you go over the years, and then finally it became like, hey, this is my time to come here and really plant. And so that was right at the beginning of the launch of the House of Prayer, going 24/7. So you were there when it was just the trailers, basically, and there was like
absolutely.
What was the feeling? And I mean, we're gonna get into a lot of the meat of what's going on these days, but I just for context, what was the feeling at that time? I mean, you came, just for everybody to realize, I think, recently we talked to Bob Scott, and Bob Scott was telling us his journey from the 80s to the 90s, and then really he was gone at that time, by the time that you guys really kicked off the House of Prayer. But something that it did for me, it contextualized people's sincerity over these years, even as we look at IHOP KC and what happened with Mike and some of the downfall. It seems like people write off so much of everything when really there was some very sincere Jesus-loving people that came there not for a cult they came there because they were passionate about Jesus, it sounds like. I mean, what was the feeling in the early days, man, just from your experience?
Yeah, in those days, Mike was teaching. The Forerunner message wasn't equated with specifics and details on the end times. Mm-hmm. It was more of become a voice, not an echo, through the knowledge of God. It was about the knowledge of Jesus, the beauty of Jesus, the go deeper in the knowledge of Jesus. And so, there was this, how do I describe it? This hunger to go deep in the Word. I mean, I remember in the Friday and Saturday nights, Mike just had the sanctuary open where teams were playing, and we would read the Bible for 6 hours from 6 p.m. to midnight in those early days. So it wasn't hypey. It was just stirring the hunger of, hey, in order to be a voice, not an echo, you need to know the Bible. You need to give yourself to long, loving meditation on the person of Jesus. And as in my late 20s and early 30s, it just laid hold of me, the pursuit of the knowledge of God, and reading the mystics and reading A.W. Tozer and reading the attributes of God and giving myself to some of those more classic works on the knowledge of God, where I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, everything felt new, the whole, worship and prayer coming together. I mean, more times than not, you would leave a horrible worship set. I mean, as far as quality, we're used to the amazing worship leaders now, but back then I was a worship leader. It was horrible. It was terrible, and if you didn't have teams that were full, Mike would pick somebody out of the audience to get on the drums or the bass. And so it was pitchy and bad songs. And yet more often than not, you would, follow along in your Bible as they would sing the word. You would end up crying. And the Revelation hymns and the Psalms became alive. And the apostolic prayers, they were human friendly and for the church, and they were God focused. And there was this sense of everything was connected to the word. Everything was getting back into singing the word, praying the word, meditating on the word, giving yourself to the word. So I grew up in a denomination where I didn't open the word that much and hadn't, we sang hymns, but as far as singing the word, these were new concepts for me.
You're saying you had your excitement of singing the word, and there was like just spiritual potency and excitement in those days. So
and hunger, unbelievable hunger, unbelievable thirst to understand who is this that we love, Jesus, and to love him with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that he's worthy to be worshiped and prayed to in an unceasing way. That concept of the worth of Jesus was front and center. It wasn't, studied the specifics of the end times at that point. It was mostly about he's worthy, he's beautiful, he's worth our love and adoration, and why not give him a sacrifice that's great? So as a young, 29, 30-year-old, I didn't know much of anything, but I was undone by the group of people that gathered who were pursuing it together. I mean, some of the dearest people still to me were gathered in one place in the little trailer.
So,
and I remember those days actually. I just think this is an interesting contrast as you're describing your upbringing in the United Methodist Church. And so here we are all these years later, and I'm, when IHOP started, I was 3 or 4 years old. And I have a lot of vivid memories of those early years, and grew up in a very different type of religious community than my parents growing up in the United Methodist Church. My grandfather, Jack Downey, we call him Poppity in our family, was a United Methodist pastor for 40 years, got his PhD from Edinburgh, his master's from Emory, his undergrad from Vanderbilt. So we came from this mainline Protestant tradition, but I didn't grow up, learning about Lent or learning about the Christian calendar or having Sunday school between services and, doing Easter and all these different things. I didn't grow up with that type of experience. My first memories of faith were going to the prayer room, praying, worshiping, doing all the things the kids do, eating goldfish and watching Adam and Eve cartoons and going, what's going on there? They've got the fig leaves over them. This is funny. But by the age of around 6, I remember being steeped in that environment and wanting to know this Jesus that everyone's talking about and praying to and singing to. And what was weird is I would go up to my parents and say, I want to get to know Jesus. I want to pray this prayer. And my parents would say, especially my dad, Samuel, this is something about giving your whole life to. This is not just something you do. You're really young. You need to wait till you're a little older. And really, you need to know that this is your whole life. You're giving your life over to him. It's not just something you do because you heard other people. So it was frustrating. Like, I couldn't pray the sinner's prayer. I couldn't just do this thing that the adults were doing. There was a sense of this is serious. But I remember one time my mom was doing I think Pilates in our house. She was very regimented and disciplined with exercise her whole life. And I remember going up to her and, Mom, can I talk to you? And she pauses, back what is the cassettes or whatever, the VCR tapes, and it was, what's going on, Samuel? And saying, I want to give my life to Jesus. And my dad's not there, he's off working at the house of prayer. And so my mom actually is leads me through this prayer, and I invite Jesus into my life. And so I remember, Dad, you coming home, and the first thing you did is, we've got to go get Samuel Bible. And so we go to Mardell's. We drive from Belton, Missouri, all the way out to Overland Park, to Mardell's, and I get myself a Bible, and I get my name engraved on the front, and I get a highlighter pack. And I remember at that age, when my dad would come home, I would go grab his Bible, and I would open up and I would highlight the Bible the way he highlighted the Bible. And all I remember is around the age of 7 or 8, my favorite Bible verse was Psalm 27:4. One thing I desire of the Lord, that will I seek, to dwell in the house of the Lord, to behold the beauty of the Lord, to inquire in his temple all the days of my life. I butchered it a little bit. I knew it better at 7 than I know it at 29. And it was there was this palpable hunger to really, I would say, if I could define it, it was the word beauty, the beauty of God. My wife grew up fundamentalist Baptist. All she heard was, you're a depraved sinner. You're going to go to hell. You need to have this salvation experience. I didn't get that growing up at IHOP. I didn't at those first years. I wasn't hearing this kind of Baptist evangelical message. I was hearing things like, God is beautiful and he loves you. And when you go and you pray to him, and when you worship, and when you open your Bible, he is a real person who wants to be in your life, and he's present with you. And from a very early age, I developed this love for the Bible, hunger for the Bible, and I would read the Bible and I would pray. And what's weird is I look back and we can go into this later. I wish I would have been platformed way less. I didn't have any. There's a lot of things that growing up, I realized how that negatively affected me, but
just so everybody knows what you're saying, saying platformed as in not put on the stage in front of everybody to share your testimony or share a word or.
But long before One Thing conferences were down at Bartle Hall, I was in that prayer room, walking up on that mic and sitting down next to those adults to pray. And no one was saying, go up and do that. It was almost like the whole environment rewarded spiritual hunger, and you're this kid. So you just go, you lean in so I remember some of my youngest memories were praying on the microphone and praying the Bible. And so in a lot of ways, those early years were way more shaped around communion with God and prayer and scripture. It was only later when I was 10, 11, 12, where I remember we're studying the detailed charts of the book of Revelation and doing trivia on eschatology in front of our whole church. And, IHOP is not a monolith. Not just people have different experiences. They're almost different iterations of what the IHOP experience was like.
In different seasons.
That makes these, and because I was there from 3 years old till 21, 22, I kind of got to be a part of a lot of the different seasons. But yeah, that's a contrast with my dad's childhood and my childhood. In those early years, all of my passwords have in them, and emails have, now I have to change them because this is going live, but
we'll bleep that part out.
Back, yeah, no, you can, I'm half kidding, but it goes all the way back to that Psalm 27:4 verse that later they would name a global conference around, and tens of thousands would come every year.
Do you have any questions? So I'm noticing right off the bat, it's funny because when you say I went to my dad to have him help me pray the sinner's prayer, like back in the day I studied the Wesley brothers. Literally, that reminds me of things that I would read about in their biographies. Like, no, you're not saying it until you're ready. Like that's like a good Wesleyan right there. I love it.
It's true.
I love it. I love it. So I think I just want to highlight what you said, Samuel, that IHOP is not a monolith. Neither is the majority of these Christian movements are not monoliths, where you're seeing positive things and then you see big leaders fall, etc. There are so many people that were a part of these things that had real, genuine experiences, conversion experiences with Christ, and they're forever different because of it. And so many people during the fallout of these kind of things, a year ago, to see Mike Bickle fall like this, had so many people reeling about, well, what was true, what was not. Bible verses are still true. Like the reality of who Jesus is still true. And just because you're in a location where somebody was completely, backwards doesn't mean that your experience with Christ was not true. So I really like what you said there, Samuel. Let's get in. I want to ask a question, Alan, and Christina, feel free to jump in if you have any questions on this. But I want to know, in your first, when was it that you began to have the yellow flag? Sometimes we see, I saw red flags, but early on you see kind of yellow flags. You'll kind of see these situations or scenarios, whether it be about Mike or the movement or whatever it was. At what point did you kind of take a pause and say, does that make sense? Talk to us about that, if you would.
Yeah, it does. Well, I think for me it would have been after the Tyler Deaton crisis.
Paint that picture for us, if you would. So many people don't even know what that means. So if you could give us the...
Yeah, I think I'll, right before I do, I think I'll first say there was a phrase that was said often, especially in the early days, but continued on up into the 15, 20-year mark, which is, we're building the ship at sea. I know you heard that phrase a ton. And that phrase, fortunately gave a lot of people freedom to pioneer, throw, if you're going to play football and you're the quarterback, Mike would say, throw the ball, even if you throw an interception. We're building the ship at sea. Risk, go for it. But unfortunately, that gave leeway to lots of practices that were not only not helpful, but could be harmful. And one of them is the Tyler Deaton, crisis when, Bethany Deaton, she died, and it was being investigated whether or not it was a suicide or that moved into a period of 2 years where there was a gag order from the lawyers for any of us involved not to say anything. And in that 2 years, it ended with the prosecutor dropping the charges so that it's still an open case, but it could be tried in the future if there's the right evidence and the right timing. So it's not a closed case to this day, which is why I can't really talk about it much.
Understand.
In case I'm called to the witness stand to be a witness. So, but I think what it began was we did not have proper reflection. And I began to notice that the rhythms of 24/7 were creating such dynamic, such intensity of leadership. I mean, to lead a ministry where the tide never recedes. There are no holidays. The rhythms, it's like a hurricane force wind driving you. So that family rhythms, societal rhythms don't line up with it. There's no breath. There's no reprieve. And you're under this enormity of the prophetic history and all that you have to do this because, the end time revival depends on it, the salvation of Israel, the church operating and what it's supposed to in the coming of Jesus, you can't let the fire on the altar go out, not even for a second. We're going to do this till Jesus comes. And so as a leader, that puts tremendous pressure to build. And so when do you have time to reflect? When do you have time as a leadership team to go, hey, this is an experiment. I've heard that, Zinzendorf did this, but he didn't leave us notes on the rhythms and certain dynamics that are involved in that. And he wasn't doing it like we're doing it. This was intense. These were full worship teams, 300 people in the room at any given moment, with 500 to 1,000 full-time intercessory missionaries. And it was still difficult, even at our height, even during the awakening, and the money's good, and the school has about 1,000 students, the internships have 1,000 students. It was still really difficult to pull off. And then you're building the ship at sea. You're not having time to do the proper leadership training you need. You're trying to raise a family. You're dirt poor. You don't have finances. I wasn't taking a salary. I had to raise it. I'm traveling all over the world just to make ends meet so I can feed my family and not be as bad as be considered worse than an unbeliever if you don't take care of your family.
Hey guys, this episode is brought to you by Wake Up and Win Insurance. We help clients all over the nation with their term life, whole life, or universal life insurance, and we're definitely happy to help you with a consultation.
Check the description below for more info.
I mean, the pressures, the enormity upon leaders to do the grind. And then you have a boss who measures time in 15-minute increments and wants you to live the power of a focused life. And yet people are coming from all over the world, 1 million people, any given year, there's hundreds of thousands of people coming. During Christmas, we have a one thing conference that's 20 to 25,000 young people showing up. You just never got reprieve. So what gets sacrificed? Reflection, discussing philosophy of ministry, because you're too busy just surviving. And I could draw boundaries around my family, but as far as boundaries on leadership, to do the right things as far as reflecting, analyzing the fruit, how are people's finances? Are we leading? And so all of that philosophy of ministry, Mike didn't like to discuss. It wasn't pragmatic. We had too many holes to fill. Mm-hmm. We had too many slots to look at. We had too many problems to solve as far as right now to keep the fire on the altar. So that lack of reflection began to weigh heavy upon me, because there was discipline going on, but I don't think we ever discussed the philosophy of discipline.
When you say discipline, you mean philosophy of discipline, and as far as disciplining students or things like that, you mean?
Yeah, when things happen, when bad things happened, you had these isolated silos on the base of, if you were in the internship world, that was your world. If you were in the school world, that was your world. If you were in accounting, that was your world. If you were in, whatever area, there were these silos. And if you were dealing with problem scenarios, they were going up the chain to Mike. But we weren't sitting as an ELT. I might never know what the night watch is dealing with. Because Stuart's going to be dealing with Mike, and to save time in a smaller setting in a back room. So we weren't reflecting. We were problem solving, doing the best we could. But you know what? When you have a seismic shaking, like what happened with Tyler or other scenarios, you've got to pause and reflect. How are the rhythms? When you have such turnover like we did, that doesn't even count the leadership dynamics of massive turnover, because raising support was so difficult. People could only do it for a few years.
Yeah.
So just the natural organizational dynamics were almost insurmountable.
Yeah. You have something to say?
Well, I am curious. hearing you talk about like Christmas and holidays, I remember Austin Roberts mentioning that too. Whenever we talked to him about the prophetic history, and him and Blaise were like remembering missing Thanksgiving, missing Christmas with their family. And after it was finished, his mom, Blaise's mom, listened to it, and she called us, and she was like, she said that she was like crying listening to it because she remembered those days of Blaise being there and missing holidays. And she said she remembered him being so thin from like fasting all the time and so like unhealthy. So just hearing you say that, and then imagining that he was just a single guy at the time, but you're a father who has a wife and kids. And then to hear you say, I don't think I realized that you're also traveling. So
Sure.
So you had a very full plate. What was that like as a dad to, you know, how does family fit into that? Or how did you make it work?
It was very difficult. For me, I would just draw a boundary around what was the rhythm for my family. So I didn't compromise that. I can remember Mike, and Mike will let you do 4 or 5 jobs if you don't draw a line. And so I can remember just drawing a line that Fridays and Saturdays were my kids, and period. And it didn't matter if, I can remember one time, what's her name, the vice presidential candidate, came into town, and they called and said she wants to meet Sarah Palin. Mm-hmm. She wants to meet. You know, I would just say, no, it's my kid's soccer day. And so I was able to do that with my family, but I was the associate director. It was a little bit easier for me. You know, I just did it and said, you know what, my family comes first. And I'm not you know, my children aren't expendable, not even for IHOP or 24/7. So Mike would try to get me to preach on Saturday nights, and we had a Saturday night service and Sunday morning. And he would say, if you're going to preach on Sundays, you have to preach on Saturday night too. And I'd say, well, then I won't preach. And for 5 years, I didn't preach on Sundays because he wouldn't let me do one or the other. And so, and he would continue to ask me, and I'd say, no, my kids need to see me watching them play soccer. They can't see me thinking about the sermon. I need to be there. And so for me, family was a priority over and above. I didn't sign for the Global Bridegroom Fast. You know, you have to be there every, you know, first
Which
Monday,
is 3
Tuesday,
days
Wednesday.
Out of every month, right? 3 days
the first Monday,
extra.
Wednesday, and
yeah.
Monday to Wednesday of the month. But if it worked better for my family to go on vacation those first 3 days, we went. So I didn't want to sign it. So, you know, but the rhythms were very difficult. If you were an associate director or a leader where you could, you know, do that and get away with it, man, you're just part of the culture, and the hours don't add up. And it's very difficult.
Well, and so, Alan, I just have to say something because I love what you're saying, and I think it's, Samuel, you could probably speak into it a lot as a kid growing up, seeing your dad do those things, like actually put family first. But I have to say that in the culture, it wasn't, you know, people wouldn't know that unless you're saying that. You know what I mean? So, like, when you look back, what was preached from the front was not that type of communication. That was not that type of messaging. So you had this feeling, all I can think of is urgency of the hour, urgency of the hour, urgency of the hour. And it almost actually gives this feeling of like you cannot slow down. And so you have these young people
Absolutely.
that eat from that table consistently. And, you know, at the time I wasn't married. So like Christina said, we weren't in a relationship. I don't know that we would have ended up in one if she had met me at that season. She'd be like, no, thanks. But like, I definitely think that for so many people, they didn't have the option. They didn't know that, that there was anything different than what they heard. And so I think there's a lot of people that have had a very hard time, young people that have had a very hard time, and even people in their 20s and 30s that were just in the beginning of their marriages. They came in, they heard these intense messages, and they, you know, maybe they just spent the extra hours at the prayer room while the wife sat at home with the kids and it's like, no, babe, I got to pray and I've got to do my hours and I've got to do this and global bridegroom fast. And everything was prophetically brought to the table. So I'm surprised that, I mean, you had the maturity not to sign the global bridegroom fast so that you could go on vacation whenever the heck you wanted. But most people didn't have that because they were under such a weight. And so maybe there was like 5 to 10 leaders. You say again?
I would agree. I don't know about 5 to 10 leaders. I only knew with me and my relationship with Mike, I would just say to him, I'm not doing this. Mm-hmm. And so that was my relationship. Mike was a king of everyone's going to have the same messaging from the front, but then he would make exceptions if you went and spoke with him. And so I would go and speak with him. So when I would talk to people and family, I would say these things, but you're right. The messaging from the front, everything was driven with a sense of urgency, and it didn't allow for families to reflect, for the base to reflect, for leadership teams to reflect, and really analyze why are we doing what we're doing and what are the outcomes. And so I think you're right.
When you went back to the situation in 2012, so just for context for everybody, just what's public knowledge, can you give just like the breakdown of what's public knowledge? I mean, Samuel, you can do it if you want, or Alan, whoever's comfortable, just of the Bethany Deaton case, what's known, not what you can't talk about, of course, just so that people that have no idea what we're talking about, that they could know.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Alan, my dad, shared earlier is kind of the breakdown, and there's a lot of things that can read online, and I think there's I'll say this, I know a lot of people on a lot of sides of that situation and with different perspectives and pain points, and it's really tragic. And I think what's challenging is like talking to Captain Montgomery at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office has just encouraged people that know details beyond the broad strokes that are public to not talk about it. And, and that in my opinion, people are left in a suspense to really unpack it. And I think there's a need for that and to unpack all of that and breakdowns that happen. I know I have criticisms for how IHOP handled that situation personally. I also think there's some disinformation as well, but because of the shroud of mystery, it's hard to weigh into that. And so, but what I will say is I remember my first semester going to school with actually Tammy Wood's son of the first semester of IHOPU. And because of that situation, he dropped out and was like, my family's not going to let me be here because, this isn't being stewarded well. And there's breakdowns in the community. So I remember my first semester of IHOPU, fall of 2013, just realizing that this shadow is looming large over the community, over a lot of people. And there's this shroud of mystery and there's no conversation around it. And because of that, there's a lot of different speculation and voices, but it's at the end of the day, Bethany is the victim of the situation. And it's a very tragic story, and there's culpability on many different fronts. And I know it can sound like evasive or like there's an ambiguity around it, but I think at the end of the day, I'm hoping in the future there is an ability to speak into that, and I think that clarity from different voices will bring healing and will bring pain points. There's some quagmires in the IHOP history that are going to be almost impossible to work through. And but we can circle back in a second. I did have some interesting perspective on the things my dad spoke about family and the
Please do. Yeah, I would love to hear that.
I think, and what I want to say is I have different perspectives on some of the things he shared. So for example, I remember him saying, "Oh, I didn't sign the GBF." And I think that's commendable. And at the same time, I get your guys going, why isn't there a dialogue from the stage so that there's flexibility and grace, that there isn't this partiality shown or selective kind of culture, which IHOP was very selective in how it implemented things. I experienced that specifically on multiple fronts. But I remember when we would go to eat out as a family on Tuesdays, like my parents would be like, if we're going to eat out, we need to drive 45 minutes to an hour away from Kansas City, so we're not like causing people to stumble. Like those things are, I mean this with love for you, Dad and Mom. Like those things are weird as a kid. Like people can't see us eat fajitas on a Tuesday lunch because there's going to be like, and I would say I have hundreds of those weird type of data points you get as a kid that is sending a signal that this is a unique community. This is not your normal church. And, even with, Dad, you saying, hey, I'm not going to preach on Fridays and Saturdays and those things, as someone in ministry now, I see how commendable that is. But I also know that you weren't receiving a salary after 2008 when the financial crisis happened. You are the first stipend at IHOPU you cut, so that as staff were laid off, you would have to look in the eye and say, if you're not able to afford doing this anymore, I understand. But like I'm with this, I'm with you in this, like this kind of solidarity. But I remember in those years, you having to travel so many weekends to make ends meet because you weren't making money as a president of a Bible college. You weren't making your average associate director nonprofit salary in Kansas City, Missouri. Like, I'm sure it wouldn't have been a lot, but it would have been a lot more than what you were getting, which was nothing. And so and there was a lot of challenges. People assumed because you were on the stage, that just meant you were taken care of. Oh, Alan must be doing well. He's one of the top leaders. And so for me, like I have other siblings where during pivotal years of their life, they feel like there was more of a loss of your presence in our house than when I was, growing up. And so like there was a toll in a lot of ways. And I personally think something that has stuck with me as I've had so many conversations this last year is, yes, we've been focusing on victims of sexual abuse and misconduct and the mishandlings. And this is a very important moment for them. The trauma they have really matters. But we also have to back up and realize there's other forms of harm people have experienced. The victims of IHOP are not just people who are sexual abuse victims. They're almost everyone who worked there experienced, in my opinion, a financial system that was exploitative and did not care for people. And that lingers with people. You can go to therapy and experience healing, but it is very hard to undo 5, 10, 15, 20 years of poverty and of going through that. And so that is like a sticking point for so many people. And I saw that in my own family growing up. It was normal to wonder if we would be able to pay the electric bill in 2005. We were, food stamps and truck, the food drops off from Panera and all the stuff. And like, it was a privilege to get something on the dollar menu as a young kid. Like that there was a sense of people were not being taken care of. And Mike was a very generous person. He would bail people out when they were going through things, and he would, give kids $5 bills. But then there was also a moment for me, it's like, Mike can afford just doling out money to people who are hurting. And that's generous. And Mike's generosity was one of the number one, and simple lifestyle was one of the number one reasons people thought, oh, he's a man that's upright and has character and virtue. And I'm sure there is a sincerity in Mike's heart related to generosity and things, but also Mike's coming out of it all with book sales, with big donors, with retirement packages. He's gone into hiding and he's not living in poverty right now. Like Mike came out of IHOP as the one who benefited financially from the system. All of the ecosystem was about his teachings, platforming his teachings. And so I look back and I see the wasteland of that. And I know I'm speaking strongly, but like that is the thing that pains my heart. Like as someone that's in ministry today, I don't want to replicate that type of exploitation and that type of financial insecurity. And as a kid, I saw it impact my own family. And if my dad was the number 2 leader, the vice chairman of the board, the associate director, and our family was struggling and had scarcity, and our family didn't have sustainability, how much more the person who just moved in and they're 25 with 2 kids under the age of 2, and how much they suffered even more. And so it's like they didn't have the opportunities to go travel 30 weekends a year at churches around and get little honorariums to be able to pay the bills. So I see that and I go, I am so sorry
Yeah.
to those who were harmed in that specific way. And that is a deep pain point for so many people. And it's a cautionary tale, in my opinion, to learn
You
from,
know,
and we got to take it seriously.
I think you're right, Samuel. You know, there were these phrases that rallied all of us to give everything. We're building the ship at sea. It's not just what you can give in your offering; it's what you're not getting paid. In other words, what you're giving up. And Jesus is worth it. And isn't this going to be worth it? And it caused us to move quick, not reflect on what's going on. I think people within the organization were trying to make things better in their areas. And yet at the same time, we were not slowing down to really reflect. And so in 2018, when the Chinese, my body began to break down in 2016 from doing 4 jobs, still not having enough money as my kids got into the high school years and began college. And those seasons, my body began to break down, and my father and father-in-law confronted me. And that
What year was this?
That was 2016.
Okay.
And I had to take a 3-month sabbatical, and Mike asked me to come back after a month and a half.
Of course.
And did not want to use the word sabbatical. But yet my body was breaking down, had been breaking down for 10 years. And I was having an autoimmune disease, not having enough money, traveling around every weekend just to make ends meet while being associate director, while him still wanting me to be president, but I laid it down. And, you know, speaking at we had 9 different languages on the base, and I was asked to be a keynote speaker at almost every small little conference and every big conference and and meet with every leader that's coming from all over the earth, leaders. So it paid a toll on my own body, and my father and father-in-law confronted me. I had to get my health in order. I got my health in order, but in actuality, when the Chinese came for that homecoming, they confronted us for fathering a vision and not fathering a family. And as executive pastor, I got in touch with people's pain. You know, those last few years, as I began to concentrate on leading the community, I began to get in touch with people's pain. You know, when you're the university president, you're focused in on systems, raising funds, meeting with leaders, yada, 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 and as associate director even. But when you're their pastor, when you're in their home, when you're at their hospital bed, I think it was at that moment that I realized, oh no, they're right. And I publicly repented and meant it at that homecoming conference. But I think one of my biggest sadness now, because I would leave in a few months, and I realized that the Lord, that I couldn't continue in my leadership there. It's been a 6-year journey of really trying to come to terms with this experiment called night and day prayer, what we did, what we didn't do. And I think one of the saddest things in my heart is the amount of wonderful people that were gathered there that we could have led in a better way. That we didn't have to. What would night and day prayer for Jesus have looked like if we didn't have an elitist spirit? If we didn't make people feel like if they didn't give themselves to 24/7, they weren't good enough. If they couldn't be on full-time staff, they weren't spiritual enough. What if we could have given him a different offering and really been like some of the more responsible 501c3s like InterVarsity that ensured that people were raising the right amount of money and taking care of their families and having furloughs and sabbaticals and really begin to do rhythms that honored people, that took care of people. There were some of the most wonderful people I've ever met gathered in one space and one time. And many of them have been hurt, have left worse off. And I think for the last 6 years, it's been reflecting and trying to own as much as I can. Where did I help? Honestly, I joined as a 29-year-old and was just enamored by a spiritual hero. But you know what? You wake up one day and you're 45 and you begin to reflect and go, wait a minute. No, this isn't okay. Real people are being hurt. And I think I would have never guessed what happened a year ago, a little over a year ago, that even sexual abuse would be an issue. But I think for any leader that was part of IHOP, especially myself, I'm still in a season of reflection and contrition, trying to own as much as I can and say I'm sorry to as many people as I can for anything that I contributed to an environment where people could not flourish. And as you can tell, one of the things that's happening here with Samuel and I, this IHOP has been like a nuclear bomb that's gone off in my family. Yeah. How as a father do I process with my children who are coming at it? They grew up in a system. They had extra pressures on them that I didn't even have as associate director. Alan Hood's kids, and they're going to be the Daniel generation. I mean, they're going to be, and for us, we've been on this journey of hearing their stories, being open to their criticism. It's what Samuel just did right there. That's the hood. This thing has blown up entire families. Mm-hmm. And families are having to learn how to dialogue and give grace to one another and process and give room. And Rachel and I, my wife, have had to hear some hard things from our children. And yet at the same time, they love Jesus, and we need to hear their stories. And we need to validate their stories. And so, I got Samuel up on the stage with me on one thing because I love my family. Yeah. I wanted them to be with me. I didn't want them to perform, but yet that had negative repercussions on their lives that they had to open up with me. And so anyway, I don't know if this is gone, the interview's gone where you want it, but I think Samuel and I, we really have tried to be open and honest about our time. And my boys have brought a different perspective. And as a father, I've had to own that, to go, you know what, that's really true. I'm sorry. And to all those people out there that have been hurt, I could name you 20 dynamics at IHOP that I'm really sorry for, that I wish I would have been in tune, that I wish I would have trusted my discernment, that I wish I wouldn't have had a misplaced loyalty to Mike. He was my hero. I thought he was the wisest, godliest man on the planet until you realize, wait a minute, no, that this is harmful. This is hurtful. This is not helpful. And yes, Jesus is worth 24/7 prayer, but everybody made in his image is worth being stewarded with and shepherded in a way that's pleasing to Jesus. There's one scripture that has really touched me and it's wounded me. Is 1 Peter 5, where it says, when the chief shepherd comes, all those who have shepherded well will receive the crown of glory. And I think back on this 25-year experiment. Did we shepherd well? I know we sacrificed well as far as pioneering, sacrificing everything for Jesus, but did we care for people well? And I think the Chinese were right. We fathered a vision, and we didn't father a family. And I don't know what it would have looked like differently, but I know this: I am truly, deeply sorry for every person that was hurt by deficient structures, deficient leadership, deficient reflection, all the deficiencies. And I know there's a lot of people that have been touched positively, but I'm not concerned. I'm in when you're in a season of discipline and a season of contrition, God bless the million out there that were touched positively. Right now, my heart is as a shepherd and as a father, how can the healing come to those who have been harmed or hurt? And I'm sorry for the way I've contributed. And I'm at the beginning of the beginning. I'm just starting to ask the questions and not expecting people to trust me. I'm trying to be a healthy, emotionally, spiritually, and physically healthy husband, healthy father, and healthy community member. I laid down for this last year, during this, I laid down being the pastor of the church here in the local area and just want to walk out life, not as a leader here, but not to assume that I'm supposed to be in leadership. I want to live with them. I want to walk out life with them in an accountable way where they go, I think you should be the pastor. But I don't want to assume that. My point is it's a season to ask a lot of questions. And my children help me do that, as you can tell. They are honest with their dad. And I love them for it.
Christina, you got some questions for these gentlemen?
Yes, I do. Okay. I just want to hear one of the things that I thought was just the wildest things was the whole Brad Tebbitt situation. And so I've heard rumors that's part of the reason why you left. Can you, if that's true, if that's why you left, or why did you leave? How did you leave? I just want to kind of hear that story.
Yeah, well, the Brad Tebbitt thing was another, it just didn't make sense at the time. Mike was pushing back. The way he was responding to it was very odd. It wasn't in a way that I'd ever seen him respond to a situation like that. And I couldn't for the life of me understand why. And so I had to oppose Mike and literally say, you're going to give account at the judgment seat if you don't let us investigate this. And so he finally backed off.
Hey, Dad, can I jump in? Just for viewers that are not familiar with the situation, who's this Brad guy? What's going on? The SBC, there was a list that was leaked of over 750 victims of abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention, and one of the names of those pastors that committed abuse was Brad Tebbitt, and he was a youth pastor at a Southern Baptist church in Modesto, California, and he was a youth pastor, married with children in his late 20s, used a 14-year-old girl named Jennifer Roach. And with that list leaked, she started sharing her story more. And so that came to the attention of IHOP going, this guy who oversees our adult ministry for 50 and over, like the seniors in the church, we think he's a good guy. He's a lovely person, loves the Lord. But we're finding out that there's this woman speaking that she was abused by him at 14, 15, 16. And so that kicked off this whole conversation with the leaders of IHOP of how are we going to handle it? How are we going to respond? Are we going to investigate it? And that's what my dad's referring to.
And it led to an internal investigation that led us to calling Grace. And right before I left, Grace, Brad said he heard from Jesus that he was not to be interviewed. And I said, well, I've heard from Jesus, you're going to be fired if you're not interviewed. And so the last staff meeting I was at, they voted that if he didn't get interviewed, he would be fired. So I left, but that was part of the walking that out and having Mike's resistance.
Can you give me an idea of what that resistance looked like? So you're in these meetings and
it's like a group of people or just you and him talking about it?
There was a lot of talk of Jennifer Roach being part of the woke crowd, the Me Too movement, opportunistic to grow her counseling business. And I would say, no, she's an Anglican pastor. She's given her whole life to sexual abuse. Married men, he's saying her story was so different from his story. Wow. That when we begin to follow up his references and begin to investigate it, both psychologists that were his references that supposedly restored him, both said that her story is probably the right story, that he showed narcissistic tendencies, that he wasn't really, didn't show signs of remorse for what he did. She claimed it was, sex multiple times over a 2.5 year period. He claimed it was a few kisses and touch. outside her shirt. And so when John O'Hall, the COO, went to put Brad on administrative leave, Mike resisted that and made a comment. I hope I don't have you in my corner when I'm in my time of need. I can let John O tell that story, but this made no sense to us.
Wow.
This was, what is going on? I had no category to put this in. Mike was acting in a way I'd never seen him. And the team was, they were bold behind the scenes, but in the meetings, they would cower. And it was basically Daniel Lim, myself, and John O. John O left over it. And then it was myself and Daniel really left to kind of hold the team at bay, to hold them to account that we're going to walk this through. And at each point of grace, Mike would complain about the money. They're going to come in here and try to look at the whole culture and da-da-da-da-da. And my interactions with Blaise were so delightful. They were professional. They did a great job. And they released a report. I was already in Colorado Springs. And to my chagrin, they not only allowed Brad to remain on staff against the report's suggestion, Dave Sliker actually put him in a position as director of recruitment. At that point, I wrote Dave, I called Dave, I wrote Mike, I called Daniel Lim, I protested in writing. They released a statement that honestly wasn't above board. The statement said that after an investigation, internal investigation, and the Grace investigation, there's been no abuses in the last 35 years. And Jennifer and Brad have reconciled and da-da-da-da-da. And that was just not true. And Grace, though they hadn't found anything in the last 35 years, they were very clear on what happened with the Jennifer Roach. And their recommendations were pretty clear. And it definitely wasn't to put him over the director of recruitment where he would interface with minors. And I called Dave, and Dave said, well, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. You're gone and I'm here. And it was a travesty. And I wrote a protest letter to the board. And that was the last board meeting that I attended. So I don't think there wasn't a board to read that protest letter. But, this is part of my old guard thinking. Back then I did everything within the organization that I could. I confronted Mike, I confronted the LT, I confronted Dave, I wrote to the board, and I said, I will not speak on this issue publicly, but if I'm asked, I will be honest. If I'm ever asked about this. And I said, I for the life of me, don't understand why you're making these decisions. They're just outlandish. It was so grievous to me. But I not only left because of that, it was because I was beginning to see there were some differences in philosophy and leadership style and focus that I realized, you know what? I'm not going to be a help. I need to leave. I want to do it different.
It's interesting now to see how you're saying you'd never seen him act that way. You never would have expected him to respond that way. And then now, hindsight, to have Tammy Woods come out with her story, it's like everything makes sense. It was devastating.
Everything makes sense. It was devastating when Tammy Woods came out. I went, oh my gosh, they were almost the same age, the same two children, Brad 28, Mike 25. And that it was heartbreaking. It was gut-wrenching. I still to this day am like, what is going on?
Here's what I'm noticing is you're telling these stories of how the conversation went down. You said this, he said, well, I hope, to John, I hope you're never in my corner if I ever have a time of trouble. In essence, he's saying, if I get caught for what I've done, I hope you're not around, is basically what Mike is saying.
You can draw that inference now. You couldn't back then.
Of course
Because
not.
back then I would have thought he's one of the holiest guys on the planet as far as
But
sexual,
in hindsight, and the reason I'm saying hindsight, not for you for the future, obviously you're going to get it for the future. It's going to be easy, clear as day now. But for leaders and leadership cultures and for the next generation of leaders, it's like when we see things that something's not right? Something doesn't make sense here. And then suddenly you start seeing, okay, they're putting this person in a place of power over minors that has sexual abuse with minors in the past. Now, at this point, would you say you would have gone public if you know what you know now? Or not necessarily that you wouldn't have known of Tammy Woods and all this, but what would you say to yourself then? Are you saying my old guard thinking? So what would you say your new thinking is at that? Would you have told yourself, hey, get out there? Like, what would you?
You know what? I think at that point I would hope to know what I know now, that I would have been adamant. I would have protested. I wouldn't have just protested to the board. When the boards dissolve, I would have blew the whistle. Hopefully, I would like to think that now I would blow the whistle, or I would get other church leaders involved, to look into this. At the time, I didn't. Now, knowing what I know, I would hope that I would blow the whistle.
Question on that, and
Go ahead.
well, just like what I'm thinking is culture of honor. That idea is that what you were going to say too? Mm-hmm. It's this thing, and I heard you say it, and it makes so much sense because I've carried this type of thing over the years, where you say, "Hey, look, I'm not going to tell the world about this, but if I'm asked, I'm going to be honest." And it's kind of like, I'm going to honor you guys. I'm gone, but in hindsight, it's like it's called a whistleblower for a purpose, right? It's like, I am going to blow the whistle and point the finger. Why do you think this is so ingrained in the church, man? Like in church culture and church leadership culture, to the point where we would, instead of protecting the flock, we protect the leaders?
I don't know, but I think at the end of the day, we've got to do we've got to ask some really hard questions about accountability and governance structures. Powerful men, who are they accountable to? What are their boards like? Who are they made up of? Because another leader falls and we find out another board knew and covered up about it. We can't continue like this. And so everyone would like to say, and I would have been one of those, you would never go. I mean, it would be horrible to go to the newspaper. It would be horrible to go up on Wake Up and Win. It would be horrible to go, to Julie Roy's. And at the same time, well, beloved, our eldership and our governance structures are broke. There's no accountability for powerful men who are not being held in check. I mean, Mike had a bunch of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds. All of us were. I was one of the oldest that made up that leadership team. That leadership team changed 20 times. Everyone, there was no stability like you were going to be there. You could be gone tomorrow. There was always Mike had control, and Mike was, it was hard to stand up to him in that sense. Number one, he's your hero. But number two, just the dynamics and the lack of accountability. If the church is not going to govern well, there's nowhere else to go. Beloved, people have asked me, what do you wish would have happened in this whole scenario? I would have wished he would have been accountable. Mike would have been accountable, and he would have entrusted the truth to his brothers and sisters. And this could have been walked out in a godly way without having to put it in newspapers. But to be honest, in the midst of fragmentation and no government accountability, no governance, and celebrity Christianity, when people are put up on pedestals and made idols, where else are you going to go? And I hope I would have gone, looking back, I hope in 2018 I would have gone and been a whistleblower. But back then, honestly, he was still my hero. I still thought he was one of the most godly men. He's smarter than anybody in the room, and he's been doing this a lot longer. And so I did internally all that I could, and even chose to leave.
Can I ask you a question, Dad? we've talked to a lot of the people who've been victims of IHOP or close to victims of IHOP and have been hurt. But there's this other group, which are the people who are working there when this all imploded last year. And they were on pastoral ministry teams and working in internships and in the Bible college and the prayer room. And one of the biggest things I've heard from them is like actually a lot of pain surrounding you and your leadership, going like, we didn't see the grace report. We didn't know all this. We didn't know that this guy who was overseeing 55 years and older ministry is now recruiting our ATC students and getting their names and their numbers from minors to come to the Bible college. And this is someone who should have been a registered sex offender and gone to jail and should have never been allowed to do ministry and shouldn't even be allowed within 1,000 feet of children or minors. This guy was recruiting students to that Bible college you helped build and lead for 13 years. How could that loyalty and honor keep you from telling us so that we didn't send our children to IHOPU? And we knew that like that's a big thing I've heard from people. And I know people that are there that have felt that. Like, what would you say to those people?
Yeah, well, I'd say number one, I'm sorry. Looking back now, I wish I would have blown the whistle. But I did entrust it to the leaders at the time, and I did protest, and I did go as far as I thought I could. It's kind of you don't gossip, you don't slander, you don't talk about the church, and I tried to do the right thing. I really did. And I protested to Mike, to Daniel, to the board, and to Dave. But I'm definitely sorry that I had an old guard mentality. I really did, because it's not helpful right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I was thinking about that too. And then thinking about, so even in the midst of all of this, you still saw Mike as this like spiritually superior, godly man. Even after seeing the way he handled like the Brad Tebbitt stuff and all of these things, that was still never really in question for you. So this idea of the
well, it was definitely out of character. Mm-hmm. It was so shocking to me. Like, it wasn't a little bit of dissonance in me. I was loyal to Mike. He was a spiritual father to me. And I knew he had leadership deficiencies, and I didn't like the leadership culture, and I would eventually leave because I didn't like the leadership culture. And at first, I think a lot of leaders thought, we can make it better.
Right.
We can make it better. We can make up for the deficiencies. And in 2018, I realized I can't. I can't do enough to make up for the deficiencies, so I need to leave. But it wouldn't be, when you combine, you look back now and you look at Brad Tebbitt, you look at another cover-up that happened pertaining to one of his family members, then you look at what came out. I'm so broken. I don't even know if I should call him my spiritual father. I don't even know what to do now. I'm just like shattered, because now I'm looking back going, I'm in as much deconstruction as I've ever been related to that person. And now I'm I'm grieved over a misplaced loyalty, because I should have questioned in on some of his practices. Why do you have locks? Why do you have girls on your research team? Why are you alone with that person? I would be all over my peers. If that was Daniel Lim or John O'Hall or Wes Hall, I would be all over them. But we just assumed. And I want to never assume again. I want to never put somebody on that pedestal ever again. I want to live in authentic community. And we just didn't have that. I don't know if Mike, there was ever if there was ever real vulnerability among that ELT and real bonding and relationship. Mike never opened up about one thing with me, as far as his struggles. We didn't have any of that. It was so but I look back now and I go, well, of course he didn't have that. Like,
Right.
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that
he
would
had a
have
lot
been
to hide.
advantageous to him.
He had a lot to hide.
Yeah.
So what you mentioned about the locks on the doors and women in there, I know Elizabeth Herder had mentioned. So that's something that you saw too, where you saw women going to his office, doors closed every day, bringing him food, getting things out of his pocket, just ran like stuff like that.
Well, the
you
doors
noticed
were
that?
locked. Well, the doors were locked because he always said he didn't want to be bothered. He's got limited time. He's got to do those 150 chapters. I mean, it's, Mike put those boundaries around him and his time and his space. And he had a personal assistant that was back there. But then occasionally he would have a worship leader back there who was a female. And I just knew the door between my office and his office was locked, but I never thought, he never made one sexual innuendo. He never made one sexual joke. Those kind of, if he would have done that tipped me off that this was an area. But he said he didn't struggle with this area at all.
In fact, he did the opposite. He preached against it heavily. Right. He said he never had a problem with any this, that, or the other. Like literally the exact opposite are the things that he would say.
But you know what? Yeah. Even that one worship leader's, door going into his office, all these things would have been, if he wasn't the spiritual giant hero with a whole prophetic history behind him to establish him, I would have questioned him.
I wanted to know more about your relationship with Mike. I know you said you're his spiritual son. You were like the second in command there at IHOP. So was there ever, like how we saw kind of the like prophetic manipulation with Jane Doe, was there ever anything like that he prophesied over you or spoke over you that maybe kept you there longer or made you kind of overlook some of the things, some of the red flags that you knew you were seeing, or anything like that you can speak on?
Well, it was different. I think looking back, it was going to him and asking him questions, wondering why decisions are being made or this is like that. And he would give you an answer. And it sounded spiritual and biblical and profound, and you would just assume he's right and you're wrong. One of the things that when I have gone through counseling, even in the last year, it's been take back your discernment. You just readily give up that inner knowing that something's off. Mm-hmm. This isn't right. No, this isn't, and you would just give way, and he would have his reasons and his stories and his, examples, and you would give up your discernment. And although you wouldn't be quite convinced, you just thought he's the smartest guy. And this is the danger of putting someone up on a pedestal and separating, the whole prophetic history with he's the guy that's been to the throne room. God's picked him to lead the movement. Of course, he knows better, and he could use and say, I've been in this for 20 years and I've been through 3 of these things. And you would just go, okay, I guess I didn't know that much when I joined, and I'm just a young guy. And so I never felt like he used prophetic words to manipulate me. Now, he did use the prophetic history to establish himself so that his opinion was not challenged. And so Mike was kind and gregarious and fun-loving behind the scenes. He didn't use the prophetic to manipulate me, but he was the discerning apostolic leader, the one that was in the chariot. And so you just assumed he's right, even though you went, oh, that doesn't feel right. Mm-hmm. And I don't see good fruit from it. But you just didn't question.
Dad, do you feel like that changed some with your transition and how Mike navigated your transition? I'm thinking of certain moments I witnessed.
He did. I think he began to talk to me about succession and being on this apostolic council, and the brothers wouldn't make it, but him and I would, and the rest of the LT wouldn't, and I was in a different mood then. I was saying, Mike, I remember going to him and saying, please quit saying that. You know you're going to lead for the next 20 years. I'm going to be 60 years old. We're both going to agree not to turn it over to me. Just stop. Just stop that. I would rather model demotion to my sons, not flattery that I'm going to be the guy. Just stop doing that. And so that didn't happen. But when I left, every time Mike would announce my leaving, he would tell the Gideon's 300 story of the prophetic, that some people are going to miss it. And the implication was Alan's missing it.
Yeah.
And don't you be like Alan. And that was very painful for me. That was the first time I experienced that edge of the prophetic being used to do damage control. And so literally, Alan's leaving, here's why, and he's going to be back within, a year or two. And he would always say that, and out of honoring him, I would let him get away with it. Mm-hmm. But I'd never agreed to come back in a year or two. I believed it was the Lord's will for me to leave, and that was prophetic manipulation from the front, I believe, with the Gideon's 300. And I was in the prayer room. On the last week I was in there, and it was the last day, and he got up at the prayer mic and said, Satan is, the enemy is trying to get many of y'all away from your calling, but God sovereignly brought you here, and he used the prophetic to tell people not to leave. And then got up and prayed for people who were in that, valley of decision.
Wow.
And I'm sitting there and I'm leaving the next day. Wow. And then he comes back and he weeps while he's praying. And he comes back and cries next to me.
Oh my gosh.
But he never says, Alan, I'm afraid you're making a bad decision and this isn't the will of God. And but would tell that prophetic story. So that was really painful weird. When he would do that. I think one of the other leaders talked to him about that, but it didn't stop.
I have to interject here because I just remember getting there in 2008, and then I planned to be there for 6 months. I really felt strongly. I didn't even know much about internships. I planned to be there for 6 months, pray, and then, go on the mission field or something. I wasn't sure what was about to happen after that. But I remember getting there, and I would hear these prayers from the front that were like that on the prayer mic. And it just makes me think that was something that was like woven throughout, because people would come up and they would say, if you feel called, if you're feeling like God wants to set you on the wall and you feel called and but you're having trouble, you're wondering if you should leave or whatever, there'd just be these types of phrases. And then you'd interject a Bible verse. What it always meant was about this place. It wasn't about being an intercessor. It wasn't about being being set as an intercessor, being called as an intercessor, or even an or whatever you want to call it. It was always about this place. And I remember always feeling strange about that internally, because I felt like as a young person at 24 years old that God had spoken to me to do ministry and not to necessarily just be in Kansas City. But when I got there, every prophetic word ended up pushing me to be there. And then when it would get privately, it'd be like, yeah, you're supposed to be here. And so it's interesting that you would say that as soon as you started to show any sign of leaving, it's like the same type of communication came to you.
And he did tell me that he had a dream that I would be with him all his days. That I think that, but I when I was leaving, I was chalking it up to Mike loves me and he's sad and he's dysfunctional and can't just say, Alan, why are you going and how can we make things better? So, but that was one of the reasons why I was leaving,
right.
It's because of the dysfunction, and I didn't want to be in that environment anymore. Why couldn't you just say, Alan, what's the real reason you're leaving? Mm-hmm. Not get up and tell the Gideon 300 story as I'm leaving to kind of move me. But I chalked it up as he loves me. He's sad. And maybe he's the son of an alcoholic and this is what they do. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I gave him so much, leeway, because I loved him and I learned so much from him. But that was bad. That was really bad.
And did it mess with you a little bit? Like, even though you knew you were supposed to go, you knew you weren't supposed to be there. Was part of you like, am I missing it? Am I gonna, or did you, you know what I
No,
mean? Did it mess with you?
I never felt like I was missing it.
Good.
No, I didn't buy into that narrative. The prophetic history wasn't what the Hood family revolved around. I'm a Christology guy. I preach Jesus. That's what the gospel is, what moves me. It always has. The preaching of Christ has always moved me. And we didn't talk about the prophetic history around the table. So I was never worried I'm going to miss it. And as the pastor for the last 3 years or last 2.5 years, I would see people on the other side of town and they would put their eyes down at a Chick-fil-A, and I'd come up to them and go, hey, Jim, how you doing? I haven't seen you in a long time. And they would literally shame. I'm sorry, I couldn't raise support anymore. So we're going to a different church now. I would go, what? Why? Like, you're not a second-class citizen because you can't be an intercessory missionary. And that, the pain I would see on people, like feeling like they missed it if they left, really bothered me.
Yeah.
Because you know that the will of God is where you want to be, and you're not going to miss it because you're not in Kansas City. I mean, that's just crazy. I am who I am wherever I go in my relationship with the Lord. So,
can I add something on that I think is meaningful, and it kind of sums up. It's two sides of the coin of my life. I feel like the coin was the beginning was the prayer room, the Bible, hunger for God, right? But as I look back on my life, what I see, what IHOP did well, and it was harmful, is it gave people a deep sense of meaning and purpose, that they were doing this special thing. I mean, that if you want to, Mike Bickle convinced people sitting in Grandview, Missouri in a room praying that they were at the tip of the spear of God's purposes in the whole world. And there really was that sense when you were a missionary there, when you were a musician, a worship leader, there was this sense of we are doing something that is going to make a difference in the world, that is making a difference in the world, that's endued with the presence of God and a sense of meaning and purpose and so many different facets of IHOP. And so people often ask, like, what was the control dynamics IHOP like? Like, how controlling was it? Because we're seeing these in-group, out-group dynamics that are kind of cult-like to some degree, where like if the person who was there for 20 years faithfully serving is leaving, and you're giving a story from the Bible to say, maybe you're not the soldiers who look up before they drink the water. They're the ones missing the cut. They can't be a part of the people of God and his army. That's like a huge red flag. But I would say, what was the control dynamics like? And the control was this. People, they're 30 years old. They've been doing this in 12 years. And now they got to go back to Longview Lake Community College, and they got to go work 2 jobs, and they're trying to get out of debt. And they go from this meaningful Bible, prayer, discipleship, changing young adults, thousands coming, tens of thousands coming. The eyes of the world are here. God's just hovering over this place for 9 months and healing bodies and encountering people with mental health problems and all this stuff. And now I'm just doing the painstaking work of being a human being, trying to wake up and work a job and raise a family and make it through and go to the gym and be healthy. And what I found the hardest thing for me leaving IHOP was adjusting to ordinary life. Even my faith and spirituality, I didn't know how to connect with God outside of, gallon jugs walking through and 21-day fasts and long Bible studies and 6-hour prayer room stints and the next Luingle event that this is the most important thing in human history is happening right now. And I've been doing this every year for 20 years. And and there's one right now happening. It's like constant pressure and constant intensity. I didn't know how to love God, being a husband, working a job, like going to college. I didn't know how to do ordinary life. And so for every person who goes to IHOP and has gleaned from IHOP and it's shaped their spiritual life and helped them pray and read the Bible, there's another person who left the ecosystem of IHOP that really didn't know how to do ordinary life. And something that Brene Brown says when she talks about narcissism, she says, narcissism is the shame-based fear of being ordinary. And the biggest thing that I've had to learn is to find meaning and joy in ordinary life and find God and loving him and loving my neighbors in ordinary life. So many things I was raised to vilify. My dad once wrote a blog for IHOP on, should my sons go see Coldplay? And I was not raised to listen. I wasn't allowed to listen to secular music growing up. In high school were these endless debates with my parents to see if, well, they let me listen to stuff they like. I could listen to James Taylor and U2, but, couldn't listen to, all the pop music happening growing up. So anyway, I'm sure I'll have my selective, interesting parenting idiosyncrasies one day. But he wrote this blog on beauty, truth, and goodness, and how you can find beauty, truth, and goodness in music that's not explicitly Christian and not explicitly religious, and why it's okay for my sons to go see Coldplay. But I was 21 years old when he wrote that. Like, the blog also could have been like, my son's a grown, man, like, just that's why he can go see Coldplay. He's 21 years old. Like, if all you have for your life is to think about another person's 20-year-old son and the concerts they go to, like, you need a reality check. Like, you need better priorities and better values. Like, that could have been the blog. Mm-hmm. And so I've had to learn to find joy in listening to music or drinking a glass of wine or taking a walk in the park and not feel like, am I less of a Christian because I'm finding meaning in this, and sometimes more meaning in this than how I experienced Sunday morning this week? And I say this as an ordained pastor. Like, I love the scriptures. I love the sacrament. I love the discipleship. I love the church. I feel called to it. But there's a lot of things in life that are more rich for me than even church these days. And I'm not dichotomizing God from that anymore. I'm learning to see God as all in all. He's the giver of life, that every good and perfect gift comes from the Father above. He's my Father. He loves me. And it's ironic. IHOP taught me that I had a Father who loved me. That he really loved me. But then they instituted 1,000 little things that really didn't reinforce that. It cut against that. And I've had to grow up and learn that God loves me, and I don't have to make a seismic impact on human history. I don't have to prepare the earth for apocalyptic realities that are coming. I don't have to be fasting all the time. I don't and I'm not saying that interpretation of the Bible and spiritual disciplines don't matter and all those things. What I'm saying is I'm learning to reel back and go, he loves me. The best gift I can give God, Dallas Willard says, is the person I become, a person who's loved by him and learns to love others. And I think that's the biggest challenge with Mike Bickle. It was a system all the way down. Mike was not an ordinary person. This is a guy going to the third heaven. Archangels are coming to him. Prophets are coming to him. There's cosmic disturbances and comets. It is so saturated with transcendence and grandiosity and all this greatness that I think it attracted a lot of people, including my parents, that wanted to be a part of a community that was making an impact on the world and fought for God's presence to really make a difference, not like this cold, stale Protestant kind of faith, mainline faith they were raised in. They wanted something that mattered, that made a difference, that impacted their emotions and impacted their experiences. And I think there was a lot of good in that, and I'm shaped by that. I don't want a cold faith. I want to be an embodied, emotional being who's in touch with my maker. But I'm learning
who loves Jesus with all his heart.
Yeah, but I can also do that going on a date with my wife and having an appetizer and a glass of wine, and going to a concert and hearing a cellist. And I can find God in the midst of all that.
I have to say, Samuel, that's powerful. And I think that's probably lots of people's experience coming out of IHOP. And I think probably I remember leaving IHOP in 2012, and I got a job at Parisi. I don't know if that cafe still exists out there in Kansas City. I went not at Parisi, at the roastery, and I just remember like doing life normal. And I remember one day going and getting a burger. This was like maybe 2-3 months after I'd left IHOP and the whole intense culture. I remember eating that burger, and I remember like sitting there tasting it, and I remember feeling like God's pleasure on me as I was sitting there. And the majority of my time from 2006 or 7 to 2012 was this intensity and just not finding pleasure in the natural at all, but almost that intense asceticism. And so anyway, I just so relate with what you're saying, because there's so much power in normalcy. There's so much power in community and just family and loving your wife. I believe truly that if ministers would just love their wives, actually love their wives like Christ loved the church, and be the example in marriage and laying down their life for their wives, much of the problems of the church would actually dissipate if ministers would just love their wives and care about their kids. It's a very basic thing, but that's not what's preached from the stage. It's just all the intensity and revival based on these gatherings and this, that, and the other. So, yeah.
And I want to just say this really quick in response to that. I think, my family's been on a journey. My dad and I started going to therapy together and working through things, and which is so rare to see a father who's willing in his mid to late 50s say, I'm going to go see a professional therapist. And we're
seriously, I'm so impressed. I love it.
And what I'll say is, like, I'm not the same as my parents. We're all on our unique journeys. We have similar values and we have different values. We have all these different things. But one thing I will say is, even though I look back and I see some of the harmful aspects of IHOP, and it's impacted me and my brothers in negative ways and things that takes years to unravel, I will say I've never questioned that my mom and my dad loved me more than they loved IHOP, and loved, I never questioned, they loved, IHOP more than me, excuse me. I never questioned that they loved Mike Bickle more than me and my brothers. I never questioned, honestly, if they loved ministry more than me and my brothers. And I've always felt that love. And that's why I'm so grateful, Dad, that in the midst of all the pain and the grief of this fallout, that you are leaning into the grief, leaning into so much negative emotion, and wanting to speak to people from your heart where they're at, and be a father and be a shepherd. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for you and Mom. And I'm grateful. It's a complicated story. So thank you for loving us well, loving me well.
Well, I'll say this one thing, and if ever you want me to come back, and I'll answer any details you want, Christina, because I'm sure you've got so many questions that I'm going to be unpacking this for the next 10 years. Of insider understanding. But I think the point even this time is this. Whether it started in 2014 or 16, 18, as I began to reflect with my wife and my children and see the fruit in their lives and try to discern what is Jesus for the Hood family, we had to do some heavy lifting. We had to go to some counseling. We had to walk through that my experience was very different from their experience. And I needed to hear their experience. When he first started to share with me, I was very defensive. And our family became like a little microcosm of the whole IHOP global family of different experiences. Half were great, the other half were mad. I mean, it was,
yeah.
And Rachel and I had to do a gut check and go, we need to listen, we need to love, and we need to be willing to change. And we don't have to be afraid of Jesus walking us through the dissonance right now. So that we had walked through it. So when Jane Doe called me, my sons and my wife and I entered this thing together. Like, I am walked through the valley of the shadow of death and hell this last year, but I've walked through it with this young man. And I've watched him love Jesus and weep for victims and hold me accountable and say hard things, just like he said on this thing. He said some hard things. I'm like, why did you have to point that out? Like cover me, son. And he's doing that. And you know what? if it conforms me to Christ, I want it. And we've got on, I'm looking at Samuel and I probably love each other more than we've ever loved each other and been as honest with each other. And I believe he's going to write a book on the resurrection one day that's going to be the classic for Christianity. I truly believe it with all my heart. But I will tell you this, it went through the wrestle of my son stands on his own, and I want to hear him and his pain. And I want to say this to all the IHOP family, those who were hurt and not hurt. I want to say, I want to listen. I want to learn, because at the end of the day, the goal is not Alan Hood's ministry. It's, am I like Christ? And we have watched as Jesus has walked through the land, and every Mecca of ministry, whether it's evangelism, apologetics, mega church, seeker sensitive, home church, worship, prayer, that's replaced Jesus, he has just crumbled it. I mean, think of how many centers of Christianity have just fallen and its leaders. And we can't replace Jesus with anything. And that's what I feel. What's burning on my heart these days is we need to reform church around the person of Jesus again. We need to form communities around the person of Jesus, Christ alone. And you're right, Blaise. If leaders, if godly men would be godly with their wives and their children and massively have their highest goal to be Christ-like again. You know, we need to restore the view of the Father Browns that just lead 200-member congregations and walk out faithfulness for 30 years.
Yeah.
You know, we just need to get back to he's our reward. But you know what's interesting? That was IHOP's message at the very beginning, was an audience of one. And if nobody else sees you, he sees you, and be like him. But, you know, at the end of the day, we made IHOP an idol, and we became the very thing we hated. And so we're in this place of repentance in this horrible situation that we didn't even talk about that much. But I think the Lord, you know, I'm so grateful for my family and walking out. And at the end of the day, it's their respect I want. It's their nod. It's their wink. And so anyway,
I love it.
I'll give you all the good details on another day.
That sounds good.
That sounds great. Yeah, thank you guys so much. I think we'll go ahead and wrap right here.
Yeah, just thank you guys for being so open and honest about everything, because I think people will really see that. And also, I just want to say, I know that you mean that, Alan, when you say it, because I don't know if you remember this, but I think the first time we talked a couple months ago, just real quick on the phone, and you said to Blaise and I beforehand, you were like, I just need to know if I ever did anything to hurt you guys or anything at all, just tell me, let me know. I want to apologize. I want to make it right. I want to fix this, you know. And fortunately we didn't have anything, but I just thought that was so cool of you, you know, to start off that way. And then even now, as you're saying that to just the IHOP community in general, I can like sense how genuine you are in meaning that. And so we're just grateful for the both of you, and for you guys also taking the lead, being a voice for victims and the advocate group. And I definitely do want to talk about that more. So we'll have to do this again and talk about that and the third party investigation and all of that. There's a lot more to unpack, but I love hearing your story, both of your stories, and your different perspectives of it. So thank you guys so much.
That said, folks, thanks for tuning in, and take care, everybody, and God bless. Peace out.